Hello and welcome to another Opening Explorations video with an introduction to the Staunton Gambit. The Staunton Gambit was named after Howard Staunton, who was the best chess player in the world in the 1840s, and along with Bobby Fischer, never having played Karpov in 1975, they were supposed to play. And it never happened. One of the other biggest missed opportunities for chess was that Paul Morphy in 1858 was trying to play Howard Staunton, and they were big rivals, but they never agreed on a match. And so some people think that Morphy was so good that Howard Staunton was past his prime and was just avoiding him. But this Staunton Gambit in the Dutch defense is named after Howard Staunton. So the Dutch defense is d4, f5, and we see the Staunton Gambit, which white would then play e4. That is the sixth most played move, so it's not very common. Only 2,000 examples here versus 12,000. The number one move here is g3. So the Staunton Gambit, here it is. You tempt black into capturing this e4 pawn, and it looks like that is the best move here for black, is to just go ahead and grab that valuable central pawn here with a flank pawn. So f takes e4 is by far the number one choice. And now black does have to watch out here for possible queen checks. They can be blocked, but if d5 is played in the future, trying to guard this pawn, especially if a knight jumps here to c3, there's a possibility of a check, and then the queen coming over and capturing a pawn on d5. So in order to avoid that, these checks on h5, after white plays the most common move, which is knight to c3 here, it looks like then knight to f6 is played the most often. And so that kind of stops any immediate checks here against the king. All right, so what does white do here? White is attacking the pawn, and the knight is protecting. So it looks like bishop to g5 is played most often. Where you just go ahead and target this pawn, or excuse me, this knight, which is protecting the pawn that you're targeting with your knight. So here, most often played is just knight to c6. What are other options? c6, g6, but I'll stick with the most commonly played moves first, because they're usually played because they're one of the better moves. So as you look through here and you see what the number one moves are, most of the time they're number one because they're the best or one of the best moves. All right, knight to c6, you target this pawn, although it's protected by the queen, and now white usually plays d5. So that's the one downside of this move, is that now you're chasing the knight. So the knight, almost always goes here to e5, which would help control the center a little bit. But maybe you could drop back and prevent a queen attack here if this knight is picked off. But anyway, now we usually have queen to d4. So white is now forking the knight and the pawn here and could regain that pawn. So here the most played move is knight to f7. So the reason why the knight jumped here with the intention of retreating back and putting pressure on this unprotected bishop. So h4 could be played, but the most common move is to just pick off the knight here, which is protecting this pawn. Maybe h4 could be played because if the knight captures, the pawn would recapture and chase the knight away. So that's an option. But number one move is to capture. And then usually instead of capturing towards the center, we have capturing away from the center, which could unleash the bishop possibly. What is played next here? Well, usually the pawn is finally recaptured. And, you could capture with the queen, but then that might allow the possibility of the knight chasing your queen. So knight captures is the number one move. And now it looks like f5 is usually played with bishop to e7 right behind it. So bishop to e7, that move might be safer, might allow you to castle more quickly. And it does look like white wins a little bit less often with that bishop to e7 move, but black doesn't win as often. If we go with the number one move, f5, it looks like there's more of a chance for black to win here. So you attack the knight. The knight usually retreats and counterattacks the pawn. And now g6 is usually played, which looks kind of crazy because the queen is attacking this rook, but the rook is protected by the knight. And now maybe the bishop could move here and try and prevent white from castling queenside. So the number one move is to immediately castle queenside. And then we have check. Here, f4 could be played, gaining space and kind of blocking the bishop. But king to b1 is a possibility as well. And it looks like white wins more often with king to b1, but there's only 9 examples here and 13 for the f4 move. So I don't know, maybe this is a little safer. Usually king to b1 is a good move when you castle to the queen side. So now we have castling into this open position, but can white take advantage of that? It looks like h4 is played most often to try and break things open a little bit. But now we have bishop to g7 chasing the queen, queen to d2, queen to f6 threatening a mate here. So c3 can be played to block that. And now knight to d6, repositioning the knight, blockading this pawn, and just continuation of development here. So bishop to d3, c5, that's interesting. Knight to f3 is usually played. You could capture en passant, but this pawn in the center is controlling a lot of real estate, giving white a little bit of extra space, kind of blocking the d pawn. And the game usually continues with b5. So we have opposite side castling, and a lot of times it's a good idea for a pawn storm. So black can storm these pawns forward because he doesn't have to worry about his king on this side. And white could try and storm these pawns forward. So, h5 is usually played. Then c4, driving the bishop back to c2. b4 here. And that is ignored in favor of knight to d4, improving the position of this knight. But you get the idea. Since this is an introduction, I won't go too much deeper into this. So that is one way that the Staunton Gambit which is a variation of the Dutch defense, can be played. So if we go back to the beginning and take another look at this and see what other options there are, after d4 f5, which is just the regular Dutch defense, we have e4, and once again, that is the Staunton Gambit, the beginning of the Staunton Gambit. So most often, the pawn is captured. So we'll take one more look at that, because that's probably what you'll see if you try and play this Staunton Gambit. Or if you're playing against it, it looks like that's the best way to try and keep some advantage if you can get it with the black side. So let's see here. Knight to c3 is what we looked at before. The second option is this, f3. So that's a possibility that your opponent could play if you're playing against the Staunton Gambit. And here, you don't really want to capture, because that just helps develop the knight. You kind of help them develop, and if you leave that pawn there, well then, now the knight cannot develop to that good square. So it looks like d5 is most often played, and it looks like, well, now white could capture and double these pawns up, but that is an extra central pawn that does a good job of keeping that knight from going to f3, which is a good square. So normally, it looks like you can capture with white. c4 is played a lot of times, or even knight to c3. But let's say they capture here. Well, then the best thing to do is recapture. Now the knight, as I said, cannot go here to f3. So this is usually played attacking. Then we have knight to f6, bishop to g5, putting pressure on the defender. And now bishop to f5 protects. Bishop to c4, grabbing this open diagonal. So both sides are just trying to quickly develop all their pieces. The knight jumps here, where it could reposition to g3 and put even more pressure on this pawn. So queen to d7, and black is ready to castle queenside. So we have kingside castling by white, and now the rook is on this open file. So that's good for white. Let's see. e6 is usually played here, blocking the scope of this bishop, protecting this bishop here. And now queen to e1. So the queen moves over where it can possibly jump over here to the king side for defense or offense. So we have castling queenside, rook to d1, and so the final moves, maybe an attack on this bishop, attack on the queen, block, bishop to a4, knight threatens this pawn. That is ignored in favor of, well, we're getting too deep into the end game here, or into this game. And since this is an intro, I'm not going to go much further. So, back to the beginning here. We had d4, f5, the Dutch defense. e4 is the Staunton Gambit. And usually you want to go ahead and capture here. Now, I did see something else here. Instead of this f3 move, instead of that, and instead of bringing the knight to c3, I saw that there was a possibility of this American attack with knight to d2. And it looks like that has been played by Eric Rosen in 2023. Edward Lasker played it in 1951, and then Arthur Bisquire played it against David Bronstein, but he lost because Bronstein was a very good player. I think he may have even had a world championship match, possibly. All right, so let's see here. Now, knight to f6, is usually played. And then what? Looks like there are not many examples here. F3, if that's played, now what? D5 could be played to protect. C3 to fortify the center. G6 perhaps to unleash the bishop. Finally, there's a capture here. Capture. Knight to C4. Oh, because that does allow this nice outpost here on E5 for the knight. And there are no pawns that could chase it away. So bishop to E6, attacking the knight. And now it looks like that is ignored in favor of knight to H3, at least in this example, where black did go on to win. So anyway, another possibility. These are just showing you a little bit of the variations that you might come across, that you might encounter if you try and play this Staunton Gambit or have to play against it. So D4, F5, and then here's the Staunton Gambit. So what else might we look at? Let's see. There's an immediate queen to H5, but that was only played once. So we might as well take one more look at some of the main lines. Knight to C3. And, remember, you don't want to play this move, this D5 move, if you're playing the black side here, because of the queen check, and then you can pick that pawn off over here. So, usually you're going to see knight to F6 to just protect the pawn, prevent the queen from jumping here to H5 with check. And now, what other options are there? Looks like there's a possibility of G4. That might be something that you could come across or end up seeing. So, I guess we could take a look at that. Looks like you could just play H6 to prevent that pawn from chasing your knight away. So what else? Knight at G to E2, where the knight can jump back over here and put more pressure on this pawn. So that's a possibility. But you're probably going to see bishop to G5 the most. And then here, instead of bringing that knight out, which is the number one move, what else is possible? It looks like that move, C6. Pawn to C6 is the second most played move. And then F3, queen to A5, pinning the knight here. So the queen blocks that pin of the knight. Now, E5. Oh, and the queen protects the bishop, which was unprotected, and the queen was attacking. So E5, bishop finally captures there. Then we have capture, capture. So series of exchanges here. Queen to E5, confronting the queen. Just capture, recapture. And at this point, what do we have? 6 pawns versus 6. So pawns are even, but there's this isolated E pawn and isolated H pawn. white has a pawn majority here. Black does have the bishop pair. So knight to f3 attacking, d6 defends, bishop to c4, bishop to e7, and now castling. Black needs to catch up in development here. a4 gains space because it may be most likely that black would try and castle on the queen side, especially with this bishop cutting off the king side castling, and it's pretty wide open here. So knight to c5 is played most often, but now we're just down to a few examples. So here, rook at a to d1, centralizing the rook. a5 equalizes the space on the queen side, and knight takes e5 was played. All right, anyway, another example of how the Staunton Gambit could be played. And it seems that the Staunton Gambit could be a good surprise opening, but it's kind of double-edged. You try and get an attack going on black, but black could turn it around as well, so it could go either way. But it might be something interesting to try out. So, feel free to leave comments and let me know what you think of the Staunton Gambit, if you've played it before or not. Also, like and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.